Welcome. My name is Michael Finley. I'm the chairman of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. Today we're going to have a very interesting day in re-engaging on the wolf plan. And I know many of you have come for that, and we're going to get right to that. We have two other agenda items in advance of that, just so you can plan your time for phone calls if you want to step out until we get to the wolf. We have a full complement of commissioners today, except... Who's missing?
Nobody.
Oh, yeah, I can count myself, 7. It's been so long since we've had a full complement that it's a little unusual. Okay. Yesterday we welcomed, for those of you who weren't here, 2 new commissioners, which gives us our full complement of 7. Is there anything that any commissioner would like to say before we start the formal agenda with the director's report? Oh, we don't have a director's report today. We do. We do? Okay, we'll do that. Okay. Shannon.
All right, good morning, Chair-friendly commissioners. We do have a second addition to the director's report today. Yesterday you heard Director Melcher will be over at the Capitol learning about our budget bill. He also mentioned that we had a lot of discussions this legislative session about elk damage. So up first on the director's report, we have Representative Barreto here today that would like to talk to you about those conversations. He will come up to do that, hopefully here right now. And also Kevin Blakely will be coming up. He will describe the work group that came out of those discussions, and in the end, ultimately, where we landed on future actions to help landowners address damage. So I believe Kevin will lead.
Welcome, Kevin. Representative.
Thank you.
Morning. Chair Finley, Commissioners, Deputy Director Hearn. For the record, Kevin Blakely, Deputy Administrator in the Wildlife Division. This morning I'd like to outline some of the efforts that the department has been taking to address elk damage on private lands throughout the state. I apologize, I'm going to start out really in a pretty general fashion, taking advantage of the 2 new commissioners here with some of the background. And this fits in really well with some of the discussions you heard yesterday on the hunt review exhibit item. So the state of Oregon has a wildlife policy and statute which includes managing species to prevent serious depletion and to provide optimum recreation and aesthetic benefits. As a part of that wildlife policy, there are co-equal goals for wildlife management, and one of those includes compatible with the primary uses of the land. So that's something that's always in your mind, all those co-equal goals. An additional statute presents some legislative findings on wildlife damage and basically directs the department to take appropriate measures to assist farmers, ranchers, and others in resolving damage problems on private land. The department itself has a comprehensive wildlife damage policy to coordinate field actions, and it includes the toolbox with such things as simple as advice and repellents, hazing opportunities in coordination with landowners, barriers and fences and opportunities to do that depending on what the situation is, habitat programs across some of the programs and working directly with other partners, and then a number of different harvest management opportunities and abilities to resolve damage as well. With that background, I wanted to overview some of the current elk damage issues. Throughout the state, we have seen elk population increases on private agricultural land, with subsequent rise in the number and severity of damage complaints occurring on those properties. Local district staff utilize a number of those tools that I just described, but even with the breadth of harvest management actions, there are a lot of dynamic complexities in land ownership and different levels of tolerance between landowners or even between years, depending on what crops they're raising and the rotation of those crops. And those complexities basically have resulted in varying success to address the problems, and not just in any one corner of the state, but throughout many areas of the state. Beginning in 2017, and even with some spotlighted areas of damage before that. There were several agricultural producers that started conversation with local legislators for additional assistance to address severe wildlife damage concerns. Those weren't always during the winter either. Make sure I want to point that out. Department staff began working with the legislators and their staff. We would generally provide a lot of information, try to help out, answer questions, not just for legislators and their staff, but also interact directly with those constituents. Try to better form our policies and better understand what tools might need to be either changed or available to resolve those circumstances. Some of the common issues associated with these damage complaints that we started running up against were many of these tools were burdensome for the landowners in balance with the critical farming activities they're undertaking. The damage tags, as you heard yesterday, are only valid on a single property, so when it came to some opportunity, that limited ability to really take care of the problem. And the coordination with department staff wasn't always as immediate as some landowners needed it to be, and it had some inefficiencies. Overall, the harvest management that we were able to get in coordination with landowners and utilizing sportsmen in a lot of cases was inadequate, and private land populations were continuing or are continuing to increase. And then you think about this last winter, late winter we just had in several counties in eastern Oregon. We all saw the images of several thousand elk in the Grand Ronde Valley, the western foothills of the Blue Mountains. We also locally had pastures and dairy areas that were having similar damage. The House Natural Resources Committee, chaired by Representative Witt and including Representative Barreto as a member, had a number of introduced bills to amend landowner preference program, different tools and tactics to direct the department to more effectively address these critical elk damage issues. After hearing from the landowners, producer organizations, and sportsmen, Chair Witt, he asked for the involved parties to meet that afternoon, form that work group, and wanted to have some real serious conversations. Chair Witt and Representative Barreto have really asked the department and that work group to bring back solutions agreeable to everyone. Some of the key components sought by that work group included a more effective opportunities to harvest elk causing damage and to identify opportunities to shift elk distribution from private to public land. That first afternoon, the department discussed an initial draft to review how the implementation of kill permits, one of the tools that the district biologists have in their box. Those kill permits are used by landowners and how they could be modified to work parallel within the current statute and still address the needs of the landowners and be agreeable to sportsmen. As part of the wildlife policy I mentioned earlier, kill permits are issued by district staff to the landowners who can lethally remove elk causing damage, and the elk must be salvaged and delivered to a processor designated by the department for use by charitable organizations. Kill permits are not hunting, and the work group discussed whether it is possible to make the kill permits more effective, modify the kill permits, their kill permit rules to address excessive elk damage in some areas, and have that try to relieve some of that burden on landowners to process the elk. One of the primary components of the discussion was taking elk at night as a condition of a kill permit. Taking elk at night really just means outside the established shooting hours for game mammals. Doesn't necessarily mean in the middle of the night, but a lot of times with a refuge area, whether it's other public land or private land, right next door to an agricultural crop, the elk can turn very nocturnal. Really, you're just utilizing those private lands, causing damage at night. So that's when the tool is applicable. Hunting at night is applicable there. The balance in those discussions was trying to do that, knowing that most of that time that damage was occurring during the summer months when no hunting seasons occur, and then also to put that in balance with an ability for the landowner agents to retain some of the meat while still prioritizing delivery to charitable organizations. The department has drafted proposed rules to outline the conditioning of kill permits in that fashion and is working to present that information to the Commission for consideration at our September meeting. The legislature has recognized the ability for the department to quickly and collaboratively adapt to these wildlife management challenges, work with all of our partners on the landscape, and looks at the Commission to complete the next steps. And what I'd like to do is ask Representative Barreto. He led a lot of those discussions, not just in the session, but in many opportunities before that.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So Chair Finley and Commission, Greg Barreto, State Representative, House District 58, includes Wallowa County, Union County, and then part of Umatilla County. And this issue didn't just start this last year. One of my constituents, Bill Chachas, came to me probably 10 years ago. I live out on the hillside outside of Cove, and he was bringing around a petition for landowners to sign that was kind of the landowner Bill of Rights, and he had been inundated with elk for a lot of years, and he was looking for other landowners that wanted to sign on, saying, hey, we got a problem with elk eating up our assets, and we need to do something about it. And I don't remember at that point whether I signed on or not. We have elk coming through our property all the time, and I think most people kind of enjoy seeing them, but I don't make my living off the lands, you know. So for someone who does, it's a lot bigger issue than it was for me. But when I then got into the legislature, Bill came to me again and said, hey, can we do something about this? And so just starting to look into it, you know, one of the first questions I asked Kurt Melcher was when you figure out your MO, your management objectives for these areas, do you take into account private property? And the answer is yes, we do. And so then you have to say, well, the number of elk then that you take into account for your management in these areas, where do you draw that line between how much feed they eat from private property and how much they feed off of the public property, and when is too much on the private landowner? And so I think, as Kevin said, you know, there are some tools in the toolbox that alleviate a lot of the problems in many areas, but there are some areas that they don't work. And so in visiting, we started working with ODF&W, I think early last year, having some meetings on this, and I have to throw in some plugs for Kurt, for Shannon, Doug, Kevin, Derek. You know, they have been absolutely wonderful to work with, taking a look at what tools they have right now to alleviate some of this, but then also whenever you do a bill in the legislature, there's only two questions: what's the problem, what's the solution? You know, and so when you have a problem that isn't getting fixed, you look for another solution. And in that process, I learned about these kill tags that Kevin just mentioned. And the kill tags are fine, except that they lay all of the work on the landowner. So they can go out and kill an elk and shoot it, but then they have to skin it, dress it, take the meat into the food bank, and all of the load comes right down onto the landowner, which they don't have the time or the energy to do that. So I said, can we just modify this to a point where other people with unfilled tags, you know, could come out and do this work and get the same job done, but just to modify, just really that one thing's modified. And so we did come up with House Bill 3227, introduced it. I thought it was a good bill. I thought it, you know, just changes a little bit, but my goodness, the resistance we got from the hunters groups was overwhelming. I mean, OHA, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, they came in and just absolutely hated this bill. And so that was when Representative Witt, you know, say, hey, let's have a meeting, you know. Well, it was interesting when there was so much resistance in the committee against this, and then we get into a work group, and because I asked ODF&W, I asked Shannon, I said, is there any way that you can do this within ODF&W rather than going through the legislative process? Can you do it in-house? And they thought, yes, they could. I think part of that is for ODF&W, it's nicer if it happens in the legislature because it takes a lot of the load and the heat off of them. However, when that doesn't happen and there's still a problem, can ODF&W do it within their own regulations? And so it was interesting going to that work group committee, having basically turned this bill at nothing. I don't think anything changed in the bill that I had, but it was all of a sudden, if ODF&W can handle it, they were all good with it, you know? So the confidence they have in the legislature is much different than the confidence that they have in ODF&W. So that was kind of the crux of where we ended and what I think what we could come up for as a solution was just the modified kill permit that is already in the toolbox, and so that's what we're representing this evening. So one of the things, I think one of the first questions that I asked too was whose elk are they and who's responsible for the damage that they cause? Well, they're the state's elk, but the state's not culpable. You know, the state isn't responsible. And so in a sense they are, but not to the point of commanding any kind of compensation for all the damage they do. And so and Bill has been working on this for a long time, and so I'd really like to get something done for just some of these areas. Now, Bill lives up by Starkey, and granted, there's a heavy elk population up there, and part of that you understand, but part of it too is as he's raising cows up there, and the elk are eating up all the feed. You know, there has to be some kind of medium there that says, you know, the landowner has some rights and they ought to be able to protect them. So I did bring some pictures that I'll give these to the panel, and you can look at it. Bill just sent these to me last night, but he said, we don't have any cows on this property. This is the corral where they can't get into, and this is the area where they're eating off. And he said, they'll eat it all off. He said, and he has elk in there every day, every evening. But one of the things I also wanted to emphasize about Kevin said it, but I'd like to emphasize that this is not hunting. This is just controlling the elk that are in there. And that was the big issue in committee was, you know, they wanted to apply it to hunting and shooting at night. And I said, no, this is not hunting. This is just controlling the elk. And when do the elk come in to eat? Well, they come in at night. And so it was an issue and probably will be an issue. But if we have what's the problem? What's the solution? The problem will not be taken care of during the daytime. It'll be taken care of when they're there. And so I think that's what I want to leave with. I also made copies of the bill that we introduced, and you can go through that, but it basically outlines everything that is currently in a kill permit, and then adds to it that I think Doug Cottam modified it a little bit in that we kind of wanted it to be utilized by whoever was available. One, the landowner would have to give permission for these people, but if they had unused elk tags that hadn't been filled, if they were handicapped, you know, whatever you could put in there to say, these folks can take the load off of the landowner. If they shot at night, we wanted the landowner to be present so that he could say, you can or can't shoot in this direction, whatever. So we tried to put in some sideboards on that to where it wouldn't just be uncontrolled. So, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Representative. Any comments, questions? You know, Representative Barado, there are many times over the last 8 years that some of us have been sitting here and we're talking about landowner preference permits,
Yeah.
and the problems with agricultural damage. Not necessarily what you're talking about in Eastern Oregon, even here in Western Oregon on the slopes of the Coast Range or the slopes of the Cascades. And it's always struck me that in some of those cases, here we have, you know, the state owns the wildlife, and private property owners that are suffering the damage of wildlife that they put up with. And as we look at the coming revenue stream, maybe the sharing of the federal legislation, there are places that I believe the opportunity is fencing. Now, not the large landscapes, which are impracticable, but some of these smaller ones where we have damage, just prevent it. You know, that old phrase about good fences make good neighbors. And And so that might be something that you think about as a public fund. It's another way to mitigate the damage without having to have the landowner do anything but close a gate on the small scale.
Well, if I may comment on that, I
Sure.
appreciate that. But if you talk to any landowner out there, rancher fencing is very expensive, and you know that too.
Yeah,
And,
that's why the public funding.
yeah, so it comes down to how much can you afford and
Yeah.
who's going to pay for it. And so one of the other things when you talk about, fencing, and we have a bunch of wolf issues today, I said, good gosh, if you could take some of that wolf urine, and just squirt it on every fence post, and maybe have a howler out there in the middle of the field, that might take care of some of that too. But I know, when you do have the problem, you look for solutions and what's the, easiest and most efficient, cost-effective, means to do this. Fencing would be nice, but it is extremely expensive.
Yeah. Any others? Well, thank you for coming.
Thank
sharing
you,
that with us.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, Shannon, where are we next?
Chair Friendly Commissioners, we had one additional temporary rule signed yesterday that we would like you to consider today. It's part of this tan sheet. Pretty simple process. We're in the phase of construction on E.E. Wilson where it's time to look at reducing removing the bag limit and letting folks take those fish home, as well as we'll have to close that pond while machinery's in there. So I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read that. It's 635-017-0090, modifications to the E.E. Wilson Wildlife Area Pond in the Willamette Zone. And for the public, I'll read this. This amended rule is needed to modify current angling regulations in the pond due to construction activities. This rule will remove the trout bag limits from June 7th through June 9th to maximize use of the trout in the pond. Additionally, the pond will be closed to public access from June 10th through July 5th to provide public safety during the construction. Do I hear a motion?
I move to adopt temporary rule number 1 in the TAN agenda for Friday, June 7th, 2019.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Commissioner Atkinson, seconded by Commissioner Wall. Any further comments or discussion? All right. All in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, it passes unanimously. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. And Chair Finley, if I may, one notice, we do have a green Honda CRV with its lights on outside. So it's going to be a long day. Might want to go turn them off sooner rather than later.
Okay. All right. Exhibit F, salvage of road-struck deer and elk.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We're going to call Kevin Blakely up again.
Okay.
He's also here for G, so depending on if we have public testimony, you might just keep him around.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Again, good morning. Chair Finley, Commissioners, Deputy Director Hoon. For the record, Kevin Blakely, Deputy Administrator for the Wildlife Division. Exhibit F. The Commission adopted administrative rules back in October of 2018 to implement Senate Bill 372 from the 2017 session, which permitted the salvage of deer and elk that are accidentally killed as a result of a vehicle collision. Upon filing those rules, we were notified by Secretary of State's office that the specific rule numbering we had in a section of the chapter in Division 43 in that chapter had been used in the past. Ordinarily, that's a very seamless process, but we just missed that step to go look for that. And we were required to complete some temporary rulemaking with a new rule section number. So none of the specific rule language that you see in those OARs has changed that were approved by the Commission, but permanent rulemaking is required to complete the intended Commission adoption of the permit rules in Division 43. I also wanted to just give an update on the roadkill salvage permits. We get lots of questions on those from media, public. We still loop back with legislature as well on where we're at on those. It's a web-based permit form, and we started that on January 1st of this year. And through the end of May, there have been almost 300 permits issued. About 240 of those were for deer, and the others for elk, and black-tailed deer account for about half of all those permits. Field offices is a component of that. They've been processing the heads. It's a mandatory check-in of heads of any roadkill salvaged animal as a continued component of disease surveillance. So that's going along well. So that concludes the breadth of this issue for today. And Chair Finley, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Commissioners, any questions? All right. This amounts really just to a technical approval of what we already approved, correct?
Chair Finley, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Do I hear a motion?
I
Okay,
would move
Commissioner
to
Wall.
adopt OAR 635-043-0175 as proposed by staff.
Okay. Second. It's been moved by Commissioner Wall and seconded by Commissioner Biddle. Any further thoughts or comments? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, passes unanimously with 7 commissioners present. Okay, thank you, Kevin. Well, you're up here too now for this.
Yep.
Okay. Burns Paiute Ceremony Harvest Tags, Exhibit G.
Thanks, Chair Finley, Commissioners, Deputy Director Hearn. Again, for the record, Kevin Blakely, Deputy Administrator in Wildlife Division. I might try to go for a hat trick today. At the December 2018 Commission meeting,
What did you drink this morning? You're spun up.
the staff presented consideration for ceremonial tags, which were issued to members of the Burns Paiute tribe. Burns Paiute tribe is a federally recognized tribe of Northern Paiute Indians in Harney County. That presentation outlined a season start date of January 1st each year. You also heard from one of their Fish and Wildlife Commission members at that meeting. And the presentation started with all those species, which are deer, elk, and pronghorn, with the season start date of January run. When the OARs, though, in that packet and what we filed with Secretary of State had an error in it. And so we found out about that. It referenced a start date of August 1 for pronghorn instead of January 1. So when we became aware of that, again, we used the temporary rule process, filed that to correct the annual start date for this current year for the pronghorn season. And temporary rules are only in effect for 180 days. So the requested action today is for consideration on this issue, really is just to amend that rule pertaining to changing the August to January for the correct date that was agreed upon with the tribe. The purpose of continuing, or the purpose of doing this rulemaking is again to continue the recognition and cooperation and the relationship we have as a state with the Burns Paiute tribe. And again, recognizing this is more of a simple correction to a filing, be more than happy to answer any questions.
Commissioners, there's no public testimony, so if you have any questions or comments to Kevin, you have the opportunity. All right, I'm going to call the question. In fact, I'm going to make a motion. I move to amend OAR Chapter 635-043-0150 as proposed by staff.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved by Commissioner Finley, seconded by Commissioner Woolley. Last chance. Okay. All in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, passes unanimously by the 7 commissioners present. Thank you, Kevin. Okay. We're going to move to Exhibit H. The Oregon Wolf Conservation and Management Plan, 2019 update. And Derek Broman. Morning, Devin. Derek? Are you as perky this morning as your counterpart there, Kevin?
That is an impossibility any day of the week.
Okay. All right. Floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, Chair Finley, members of the Commission, Deputy Director Hearn. For the record, Derek Broman, I'm the Carnivore Fur Bearer Coordinator. And yes, today we are bringing forth the updated version of the Oregon Conservation and Wolf Conservation and Management Plan. And before I get started, I want to point out that this product is the product of enormous effort by numerous staff, by engaging with hundreds of stakeholders. And I want to acknowledge Russ Morgan for really putting in the lion's share of work for the first 2 years of this update, really arguably doing the bulk of the work to get the first draft composed and to help facilitate a number of our discussions. So just wanted to make sure that everybody recognized that Russ was a very, very important part of this process. So for my presentation, I'm going to give a brief history about the Wolf Plan history, go into details on our current update timeline, address the guiding principles that we followed, and then make some general comments, but the majority of this presentation is going to be going through each chapter and highlighting a bunch of the notable changes that have occurred. And then I'll wrap it up with a very brief summary. I think I brought the coffee. So, the first wolf conservation and management plan in Oregon was adopted in 2005. And that was the product of a 3-year process that even included a wolf advisory committee. It was the largest public process that the agency had undertaken. That product involved numerous negotiations. So the criteria, the things outlined in that plan were not taken lightly. And what's very, very impressive is that there were no known wolves in Oregon when that plan was adopted, which is pretty incredible for a state agency to be doing something like that. And I will give those folks quite a bit of credit in that because we had no wolves in Oregon at the time, they had no contemporary information to be making predictions. Yet, as we've seen over time, a number of the predictions made in that plan have come true. So it's pretty remarkable that, one, we had a plan before we had wolves, and two, the plan wasn't bad. It's worked very well for us to date. Wolves were listed under the State Endangered Species Act, and so that required a 5-year review after that plan was adopted. So in 2010, that plan was updated. At that time, we actually did have wolves in the state. We only had 21 known wolves in Oregon. Of note, in 2011, wolves were federally delisted in the eastern third of the state. Also in 2011, there was a lawsuit that the department received. As part of settlement of that lawsuit, the lethal conditions under Phase 1 were amended. And so in 2013, those changes were made in rule and somewhat in the plan. At that point, there was only 64 known wolves in Oregon. 2015, the commission delisted the gray wolf under the State Endangered Species Act, and immediately following that effort, this plan update began in 2016, where we had 112 known wolves. And as of our 2018 annual report, our state minimum count is 137 wolves in the state. So this 2016 effort first started off really with laying out a proposed timeline as part of a director's report in the January commission meeting. I'm going to go through some of the major meetings and events where we received public testimony, but there have been quite a few, so I'll try to get through these quickly. But really, we kicked things off in March 2016 when we had a brief staff presentation followed by stakeholder panels to try to talk about what are the main topics that they want to see addressed in this review and update. We held individual stakeholder meetings and then a larger stakeholder meeting throughout the summer and provided a staffed update in August. But really, one of the first most notable checkpoints in this update was in October 2016 in La Grande, where we presented a large update. We identified the primary topics, the issues that needed to be addressed in the plan, and provide some context of why these are important. and even some proposed solutions to those issues. So going back to October 2016, we had a number of things identified right off the bat, and again, kudos to Russ for taking that on. And we received quite a bit of public testimony there in LeGrand. 2017, we started off with a stakeholder meeting, but again, of note, our first draft plan release occurred in anticipation of the April 2017 commission meeting. And so, again, staff had an extensive overview of what had changed, what was of note in this draft release. The April meeting occurred in Klamath Falls, and at the public's request, we held an additional commission meeting in May up in Portland, and it was just a Wolf-only commission meeting. The staff presentation was the same, and again, we received public testimony. We held a commission work session in June the public was allowed to sit in on, and then we provided an update in September, and in the fall, we had one-on-one meetings with the commission to talk about any remaining issues. For the December 2017 commission meeting, the staff released a working copy of that draft that was released in the spring, and we held stakeholder panels to discuss that latest update. So in 2018, we received direction from the commission to have a facilitated process to try to see if we can find consensus on some of the last remaining issues. A facilitator was hired in the spring, and in the summer, the facilitator had one-on-one meetings with the stakeholders. We then had meetings occurring from August to January, with our final report occurring in April. And along the way, we did have a check-in in December 2018 to the commission to talk about the progress of this facilitated process. In April, we updated our federal-state coordination strategy, which is an agreement between the department, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the USDA Wildlife Services on how we collaborate and work together where wolves are federally listed in the state. In anticipation for today, on April 15th, we released the draft plan, a whole 2 months before today, so that way the public, the commission, and others have ample opportunity to read the plan, ask questions, and provide feedback. We held a commission conference call in late May to talk about a number of these topics, and then here we are today. So at that October meeting in LeGrand in 2016, we laid out the guiding principles for this review and update. And those principles consisted of adhering to state delisting factors. For example, in our delisting analysis, we conducted a population viability analysis. And so through this plan review and update, we were making sure that we were adhering to those criteria and making sure that certain thresholds were not going to be exceeded, such as mortality thresholds and things like that. Our focus was to maintain a conservation focus in all phases of the plan. But in following with the current plan that has an adaptive management approach, we wanted to continue to increase flexibility while flexibility in management options as the population of wolves increases. We also wanted to address resource limitations for the department as when we're evaluating really current and future commitments. And similarly, wanting to try to find ways to effectively share the workload with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which arguably was somewhat satisfied with that update of our coordination strategy. So some general comments on this update. The structure and flow of this update is similar to the current plan, and that was by design. This was a plan update, not a rewrite. So in certain areas, we expanded chapters and sections that were relevant, and there was a lot more information to contribute. Other areas were condensed or removed because 10 years of experience told us that perhaps these topics weren't of note or very important. We wanted this document to be guiding management and conservation, so if there was things that were straying away from priorities, we tried to remove those. This plan update reflects the current situation in Oregon. Again, we've got 10 years of experience that we really wanted to make sure that this plan reflected. Similarly, something that we're very proud of is that this plan includes a great deal of Oregon-specific data and information. That's one of the biggest transitions from the current plan to this draft plan, is that before we were having to use information from other Western states and Canada and elsewhere to try and predict what might be occurring. Now we've got a decade of our own information, and that's really, really important that we have that. And that's really arguably quite an accomplishment that we have that, that much information and those many success stories to date. Another source of pride is a great deal of scientific literature. We've got, I believe, over 300 and some publications cited in this plan. Again, contemporary citations as well, because the plan previously talked about just a lot of historical things, and some of that didn't really have a lot of relevancy to date. We did retain certain appendices that we thought were of value to the plan. We only adopt the glossary, but we wanted those other appendices to be a part of the plan just so it could be a more beneficial one-stop shop. And earlier versions of the plan will continue to be available on our website. So here's the bulk of the presentation where I'll go through things chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, which is our introduction, actually is a combination of the introduction and Chapter 1 of our current plan. In the current plan, this is where we had a lot of that additional background information, a lot of Wolf 101, that arguably any attempt to try to have the latest, greatest, all things wolves really isn't an appropriate task for a conservation and management plan. There's plenty of good publications, textbooks, etc. elsewhere that the public should likely consult if they're looking for the, what is the size of a wolf and morphological measurements, etc. So we reduced this chapter and got rid of a lot of those things that don't seem to have a great deal of value. Chapter 2 is our wolf conservation and management plan. Conservation and management. I think it's actually monitoring. That's a typo. And in it, we continue to maintain a 3-phase approach and the associated objectives associated with those phases because we've seen a lot of success to date. The current plan teases around the idea of perhaps needing to establish population targets or caps. This update continues to acknowledge that, but it does not establish any population targets, caps, or other zones, but does recognize that that is how we conserve and manage most species. We try to do things at an appropriate scale. It does identify modeling needs, such as looking at viability thresholds and effects of certain management options and actions.
Derek, can I interrupt you a minute?
Yes.
I forgot to tell the commissioners. Staff has asked that rather than wait till the end of the presentation, that you ask questions during the presentation. So I didn't want to get too deep into that without you knowing that was their request.
Thank you, Chair Finley.
So I'm
Yes.
going to exercise that now.
Yeah.
When you talked about the 3 phases, was there any discussion of extending the difference in management by having a phase 4 or a phase 5? Have you ever done that? I'm just curious.
Chair Finley, and for context for the room, our plan has 3 phases, and in Eastern Oregon we are in phase 3, in Western Oregon we are in phase 1. And to answer your question of was there discussion about a next step or an additional phase, there was, certainly. Although arguably to date we have not exercised all of the tools and options in phase 3, so to identify what would be that next need, we really kind of haven't exhausted things. But certainly, then we might come to a point where we need another phase, or it appears right now there's enough flexibility in phase 3 that we could likely do so without a term or an additional phase.
Thank you.
And I know we'll tell staff too, you're welcome to interrupt or ideally having questions before public comment, certainly because we might have many hours of that. We don't want to lose or get confused on anything.
So, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, does that preclude having any round of questions when Derek is finished, or is it just to try to lessen that number that
It allows
occur at
both.
the end?
It allows both.
Okay.
If, something on your mind that you think is pertinent before you lose it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so in this chapter, we did create a new section called Potential Conservation Threats. And again, because this is a conservation and management plan, we wanted to be upfront and make it easy for people to recognize what the department and with engagement of other scientists and the public are the concerns. What are the threats facing wolves? We've got, again, these are the threats that we have good evidence to suggest that they might be a threat. Certainly, human cause mortality is the number one concern of the departments. And so that section is much larger and includes quite a bit of information relative to the others. We documented in the plan, again, Oregon information, such as documented human cause mortalities, mortality rates, and scientific findings on these topics. We also then compared, again, looking back at the delisting factors, we compared those numbers to the viability analysis that was conducted for the delisting effort.
Derek, before you leave.
Yes.
That, if I may.
Commissioner Wall?
Derek, could you talk just a bit about what margin for error is built into the numbers that we do have, the conservation numbers that we do have, for instance, in the breeding pairs? The margin for error in those, actually built into those numbers?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, so I believe you're asking about the type of flexibility or the concerns of those thresholds from going from one phase to the next and what that might mean as far as population trajectory. And there was quite a bit of an extensive effort to look at that in this delisting analysis. So we do have real numbers out, so I'll try to remain vague without contradicting our numbers. But certainly with our phases and those criteria, we continued to see strong population growth with those criteria of the breeding pairs for consecutive years. And even then, when those minimum thresholds are met, for consecutive years, we're usually continuing to add breeding pairs throughout that time. And with the starting number of wolves that were used for the model simulations, it appeared that we are doing very well. We have quite a bit of room for some mortality factors or increases in mortality rates before we could potentially see a decline. So some of the literature and our viability analysis shows that once you're at 20 to 30% or more mortality, you might start to see a population decline. We are considerably less than those values. So we continue to see the models, and the science says that we should be seeing an increasing population, and firsthand, because we're seeing an increase in number and distribution of wolves in the state, we'd have to believe that indeed that is the case.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Thank you for that. Could you talk a little bit about the ongoing, in the conservation threats, could we talk about the ongoing threat from climate change, from fairly steeply declining biodiversity, and could that be added to this?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, certainly. In these conservation threats, we identify habitat and connectivity as one of the primary threats. And climate change is certainly a topic that all staff discuss and try to evaluate its threat and relative threat. Now, that's really where climate change would fit. However, it's kind of secondary or tertiary simply because wolves are habitat generalists and ultimately go where the food is, and as the food goes, so does the population. And so we would have to essentially look at potential climate change impacts to deer and elk and see and arguably assume that would lead to an impact on wolves. So to date, I don't know if we've been able to quantify that or what the latest status is on the potential conservation threats for climate change on wolves, but that's kind of the segue to get there. Certainly, if there's new information that comes up, we would be wanting to plug that in as a potential concern. And we do so with our other large carnivores. When we updated the cougar plan, that was certainly a topic of conversation. But again, they exist in high desert, they exist in coastal rainforest, high elevation wilderness. They go darn near anywhere. So certainly it could impact their prey, and that's really where the connection lies if we have concerns about climate change impacting prey species.
Thank you.
Commissioner Buckmaster?
Derek, thank you. I'd like to revisit the question of our chair regarding the consideration of additional phases. Your answer to him was that you felt that you had enough tools in the toolbox now to deal with the position we're in now, phase 3. in the east. It is part of our job as commissioners to look into the future. That's why we have plans. That's why we set policy. The tools to deal with what's happening right now are fine. But we're asked on a regular basis to look at what tools are going to be necessary, what policies should be in place for the future, and consequently, we don't expect to stay in the minimal numbers required to enter into phase 3, but to go beyond. So the phase 4, phase 5 that our chair brought up, regardless of what you have currently on tools, as far as helping us to set policy, what numbers would trigger moving into a different phase, what geography would trigger going into a different phase, all those things, the same things you did with phases 1, 2, and 3. To wait, I think we're at the time where we need to be thinking about doing that. So I just want you to consider tools is not the only answer that we need.
Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster, certainly tools, resources, that's always what we're trying to predict. What are the next needs? How do we adapt and have the resources match the expectations? And so this is an exciting topic. This is, with wolf, increase of distribution and abundance, it can drive some of our district staff insane because when a wolf shows up in their backyard, it means they're now an official wolf biologist. But we're also getting to test out new theories and techniques. So we're regularly on a very frequent basis trying to evaluate and recognize what's the next need. What do we see as the next problem around the bend and how do we address that?
While we're on this topic, would anyone else like to just make a remark or two or a thought on that before we move on? Commissioner Woolley.
Yeah, since we're on chapter 2, and I had a question, or just a comment from you, Derek, since we're talking about human-caused mortality, and I know you're considering authorized and unauthorized mortality within that. So there's one, this is the Chaperon and Treves study from 2016, where conclusion, or it was suggested that changes in policy and wolf management, i.e. allowing authorized take may cause an increase in unauthorized take of wolves and reduce population growth rates. So I'm just wondering what your knowledge is of that study, and is this one study that has brought this up, or is there any more kind of universal acceptance of that, or is this kind of a lone wolf conclusion?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Woolley, I won't acknowledge your use of words there. Well, that study, there's certainly concern for that. Public perception is certainly a major factor. That one publication, there were a number of publications following it that had issue with the findings and the techniques. I actually would love to see that study replicated again once wolves were federally listed again in that area. So they studied when wolves are delisted and there were hunts allowed, and they saw that there was, the animal was no longer, or they argued that the animal was no longer viewed as this, highly protected animal. One of the topics that those other authors point out is that despite that, the population continued to increase. So overall, the population health was still good. But now that it's been put back on as a federally protected species, it'd be fascinating to see what that does, because now you're reestablishing all of those protections. Would that not then mean that the public would be viewing it more as protected and reduce the number of illegal take and unapproved take? That's kind of my scientific question of what would be the next step, because if that was indeed true, you should see that response. But then again, how do you factor for the fact that there's still way more wolves? So every year there's more and more wolves in that area. And so how do you rule out additional and new exposure and perhaps a little bit of saturation to wolves? They're no longer a novelty in many places of that state where they did their study.
Yeah, so I agree. I think it would be interesting to differentiate between what is kind of a change in attitude versus what is a change in action, you know, toward wolves. So that could be at some future date, but I just want to get your take on that. So thank you, Derek.
Okay.
Okay, and this helps highlight why it shouldn't be conservation and management chapter, it should be conservation and monitoring. We greatly elaborated on our monitoring section to try to identify what are our priorities, especially moving forward in phase 3. We mentioned continued use of radio telemetry, but we recognize, or want to point out that based on the caller function, we are now using VHF callers more frequently than we perhaps thought we would. And that's very simply because the GPS callers, which record information and send it to us, they've not been doing very well. That technology has been kind of disappointing us here recently. Those callers oftentimes only last a year or two, versus the old school VHF callers that just emit a radio beacon that we have to go in the field to find that animal. Those are much more reliable. They can last 5, 6, 7 years. And so we're being strategic in that if we lay hands on, say, a breeding member of a pack, we'll likely affix a VHF collar on that individual, knowing it's going to be there for likely the pack's existence. Versus if we lay hands on a juvenile, that youngster is likely going to head out of town very quickly. So we affix a GPS collar on that animal so we can see where it goes without having to try to find it in the field ourselves. Plan lays out priorities by phase. In phase 1 and phase 2, we attempt to try to collar at least one member of a pack, with emphasis again on the breeding adult. However, in phase 3, we relax our requirements and try to be more strategic. We'll continue to call for population monitoring and research, and we'll focus on wolves in new locations and when there's issues of livestock conflict, such as areas of large number of historic conflict. Certainly, we're going to continue to look at new survey techniques. A number of Western states that have quite a bit more wolves and have been dealing with them for longer have transitioned into some new monitoring techniques, new models, using novel resources and sources of information. And included in that are non-invasive techniques and the use of citizen science. We've already benefited from getting the public to opportunistically submit to us observations of wolves, and that has helped us detect new wolves, new locations. But there's ways in which we can try to tap into the public to help them supply that input data on models and things like that.
Derek,
Yes.
before you leave that, on the collars, we've been asked by several stakeholder groups to increase the number of collared wolves to help us know where a certain pack may be, where we have problem wolves or so forth. Are we pursuing that commitment?
Chair Finley, as far as a commitment, we don't want to overpromise. Certainly, having collars on wolves assists the agency in answering questions, monitoring wolves, and providing better customer service, not only to landowners, producers, local officials, but all stakeholders. The issue is collaring wolves is in a very exhausting, very challenging practice. And we don't want to establish the expectation that we are going to put a collar on every pack or every wolf that we know, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing anything else besides just that. We also have limited windows in which we can operate. We take into consideration animal welfare. And so very shortly here, we will likely end wolf trapping for this spring. So we want to acknowledge that, yes, this is ideal, this is important. We have some priorities laid out. But again, we're trying to account for future commitments because this can be incredibly challenging. We point out that the rogue pack in the South Cascades, that's a new habitat. That's a new setting that we're not really used to. I love saying this, but we brought in some of the best wolf trappers in all of North America, and they are unable to capture one of those wolves. So it is very difficult even for the people that know what they're doing. So we're just trying to establish this indeed is the priority. This is desirable, but we don't want to establish that requirement.
Okay.
And Derek, you in the past also mentioned some budgetary constraints with the costs, and so that's an additional concern as well in terms of adding more college, right?
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay.
And Chair Finley, I do want to follow up on your question that we're also trying to explain what the callers do and don't do. These callers, the GPS callers, they do not provide instantaneous information. At best, we will likely know where the animal was a few hours ago. Oftentimes, the caller will store information and then have a data dump. And so we'll know where it was days, weeks ago, but we can't tell anybody where the wolf is right this second.
You're talking about satellite
Yes.
callers, yeah.
And so even then, we can't tell somebody that there's a wolf sneaking up their fence line. They need to go out there and haze it or check on their livestock. It doesn't work that way. So trying to help folks in the public understand the realities of what these tools do and don't do has been a priority here lately, and that's just focusing on better communication.
Okay, thank you.
We did add a new chapter. Chapter 3, it's a special status game mammal. And for a little bit of background, the designation of the gray wolf as a game mammal was called for in the original 2005 plan. The legislature agreed with that, supported that assumption or need, and indeed changed the classification of the gray wolf in Oregon from a non-game species to a special status game mammal. This is pretty huge. This now meant that Pittman-Robertson funds, which could then be used for wolf conservation and management in the state, which means that hunter dollars were now available. Previously, wolves were non-game, and so we had to use non-game dollars on wolves. And as many of you are likely aware, our funds available for our non-game or conservation strategy are very limited. So to date, we've spent millions of dollars on wolf conservation and management, and we likely could not have done so without this change. So that was a very good move, good forward-thinking action by that committee, the commission adopting the plan as such, and the legislature in 2009 seeing that need. And that also benefits our other game species, non-game species that don't have to compete with wolves for resources. It does stay in statute, though, that the commission is to define what this means, a special status game mammal, in rule. The 2005 fitting this criteria states that the use of hunters and trappers under very specific situations are an available tool in phase 3. And this is under the concept of controlled take. Certainly, wolf management requires extensive personnel, and we will exceed our capacities as we continue to have more and more wolves show up in the state. The use of hunters and trappers is consistent with the management of other wildlife species, and it's also consistent with the North American model of wildlife conservation. And again, it continues to follow the principle of increasing management flexibility with increasing populations. The plan explicitly states that there's no general seasons allowed, no general hunting seasons allowed, and it does not replace non-lethal efforts to minimize livestock depredation. So in this current draft update, again, this is a new chapter, but it compiles all the information regarding that definition and designation into one location. Previously in the current plan, you had to look in many, many areas to find these criteria. So we wanted to have this be in one location. And so that way it clarifies these criteria, but in doing so, we are arguably satisfying that statutory requirement. It's good that we have that up front so we can point right to it should anybody ask. The draft plan maintains the current plan's approach, but goes into greater detail on what controlled take means. It's requires a commission authorization. There again are no general season hunts. But proposed controlled hunts require a separate public process. Controlled take continues to include public hunters and trappers and can only be used for specific areas and situations. Now regarding commission authorization, since we released this plan, we realized there's some opportunities to continue to add clarity to that requirement. So we've proposed addendum 1, which I think most of the commission or all the commission should have, that where we added in additional language continuing to highlight that need of a separate commission rulemaking process for controlled take. So there's one location in Chapter 3, which is our special status game mammal chapter, and then 2 locations in Chapter 4, which is our livestock chapter. So controlled take, getting at those very specific situations and criteria that we examine regarding livestock depredation, long-term recurring livestock depredation. Take will only occur in specific situations in a specified area, and the take will not impair the population viability or reduce health factors in the area, in the region. Excuse me. Regarding ungulate populations not meeting established management objectives or herd management goals, this chapter lays out a number of factors that must be examined when trying to determine if wolves are a major cause of failing to achieve these objectives or goals, as well as requires the department to examine alternate options to controlled take.
Derek, could you go back 2 slides, please? I have a question on that.
16?
Actually,
This one?
17. And I somehow missed this amendment, so I'll check it. But I just want to clarify, is the only place in rule that talks about controlled take the part in Phase 3, Section 7? That's the only place that it's in rule right now, correct?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, that is correct.
And I'll probably have another question, but I'd like to go through this first. Thank you.
You bet. Commissioner Wall, along those lines, there are a number of terms, criteria in rule that are relatively succinct, and then we use the plan to to elaborate on those concepts, on those terms, on those conditions. So oftentimes the plan is just an extrapolation with more meat on the bones of the rules.
Chair? I'll go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you. Derek, on Chapter 3, this designation, you talked about setting up special status game as a requirement to utilize Pittman-Robertson monies. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I know there's been some discussion about the whole, we're going to be talking more today about the whole hunting and take and issues. But if it becomes clear in our plan that there's no hunting, A, do you think we can continue to use Pittman-Robertson? And B, if not, do we have to give it back?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster, how do I answer this one?
Derek, you are getting help from Kevin Blakely.
Well,
Chair Finley, Commissioners, Deputy Director Hearn. For the record, Kevin Blakely, Deputy Administrator in the Wildlife Division. I told you I'd sneak in a hat trick, so.
Good job.
I'll answer that question more just on the funding for Pittman-Robertson. When all that issue came about, remember that wolves were federally listed, so that was some of the overlay that was in the discussion at legislature within our agency that really constrained us from using a lot of monies. Wolves are a mammal. We can use PR monies for that, so it doesn't change anything. So you may have to rephrase your question for me as I was walking up, but it really doesn't change any of the overlay at all, whether it's hunted or non-hunted. We use PR monies for mammals across the board, doing research on red fox in the Cascade Range, so.
that are fur bearers.
Yep.
I think the designation would be if they were removed or moved, and certainly that was a legislative action, so we can't speak for what the legislature would think. But correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, if they were removed from that designation, moved back to non-game, could we use PR?
Yeah, we could, just because it's a mammal, so that's I wanted to make sure of that it was there.
Which calls the question, why did we have to make it, your previous statement, we had to make it a special status game mammal in order to use, it was a mammal before we designated it a special status,
It
correct?
was Chair Finley, Commissioner Buckmaster, it was a federally listed Yeah,
So
in the
that is a
conversation in the
listing,
legislature,
that was the
right.
criteria. Okay.
Yeah, and the other part of that dialogue was indeed just across the discussion with all the different stakeholders in regards to how can we keep up with capacity to fund conservation management efforts for wolves.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, Derek.
Okay, so I think we're done with chapter 3. On to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is our wolf livestock conflict interaction chapter. This chapter, we greatly expanded the wolf-specific information on depredations. We increased the scientific literature related to conflict, including the tools to minimize depredation. Again, this is a great source of pride. We really beefed up this chapter and the section on our non-lethal tools and techniques. We continue to point out that our website is oftentimes the best resource for finding out what are the best and most contemporary and proven tools and techniques, but the plan here highlights a number of those and is a good placeholder for folks to consider and to view. We again continue to maintain flexibility as populations increase. And in it, we're continuing to voluntarily use phase 1 requirements in phases 2 and 3, such as coordination with area producers and officials, and the use of our wolf website and our numerous listservs for disseminating information. And again, in all phases, non-lethal tools are the primary consideration when addressing conflict. We did add some clarification on a number of other topics, and a lot of this was reflected most readily recognized in rule, but regarding injurious harassment in all phases, we now clarify that livestock must be present for injurious harassment. We also clarify that non-lethal measures must be appropriate for the situation and be documented before lethal control can be considered in phases 2 and 3. And any issued lethal permits are required to be specific to the area of depredating wolves, and that it's in a situation where wolves present a significant risk to livestock present, and all take is required to be reported to the agency in 24 hours. And again, this permit is only allowable in phases 2 and 3. So also covered in this chapter is the topic of chronic depredation. And chronic depredation is that threshold of depredation events at which lethal can be requested and considered. Now, in the current plan in phase 1, the criteria are 4 confirmed depredations in a six-month period. That is the product of that settlement that I mentioned earlier. So those criteria were not really evaluated and touched in this review. However, phase 2 and phase 3, the current plan defines chronic depredation to be 2 confirmed depredations in an unlimited time frame, or 1 confirmed depredation and 3 attempted depredations within an unlimited time frame. The latter never was relevant. That was scrapped pretty early in this process. So throughout this 3-year update, staff did propose in October 2016 the new definition under phase 2 and phase 3 to be 3 confirmed depredations in a 12-month period. This was after looking at depredations of Oregon wolves, looking at the agency response when we said yes to a lethal request. So that proposal at that time reflected really how we had been conducting business for phases 2 and phase 3. However, we didn't receive any stakeholder support for that proposal. We didn't even get any groups to say that they could just live with it. So this was certainly a priority for our facilitated discussions. So starting with the current plan, we got into the weeds into our discussions, and in one meeting we finally came down to 2 proposals. One was 3 confirmed depredations in a grazing season, which would be 6 or 9 months. And there was good consensus that grazing season seemed relevant. Now, the duration or how you define a grazing season was still a little bit up for discussion, but there was a good agreement in the room that I could see some value in that. The other proposal in the room was 2 depredations in a 12-month period. And so we did not see consensus in the room that day, So staff went back and composed a new proposal based on those to bring back to those groups for feedback. So we didn't have all the members present at the last meeting to get feedback on that topic, but that is our current proposal, which is 2 confirmed depredations in a 9-month period. So if you remember back, the current plan is 2 confirmed depredations in an unlimited time frame. Then now staff are proposing from this facilitated process 2 confirmed depredations in a 9-month period. So obviously the only difference is that 9-month window stipulation. In this chapter, we also go into great detail on the discretion and decision-making regarding depredation investigations and evaluating lethal requests. The department evaluates each situation on a case-by-case basis to try to determine what indeed is the most appropriate response. And also we try to be consistent. Certainly depredation level is only one factor when determining that response, especially when we're evaluating a lethal request. Some of the considerations regarding wolves that we consider include the number of depredating wolves, the depredation history of the pack, health. For example, we've had a number of situations where we've got injured wolves or very, very old wolves that are very prone to depredations. And so that's gone into our decision making and what our response is. We also consider a number of livestock factors, including the type of livestock, the time of year, the continued presence of livestock. Certainly, again, that has been a factor come in quite a bit in that we will reach chronic and receive a lethal request. However, a grazing allotment season might be up, and we know that the livestock are going to be removed from the landscape in a very short amount of time, essentially eliminating that threat. And so those types of factors have gone into our decision making. But this was a hot topic at our call last month to talk about, really how can we quantify and demonstrate this discretion that the agency has exhibited. Because very simply, meeting the definition of chronic does not automatically result in a lethal request, nor does it result in lethal removal actions. So we looked at all the requests that have come in to date, and we've received 20 requests, but 4 of those were when we were already, a lethal removal action or effort was already ongoing. So essentially, for this discussion, we're talking about 16 individual requests. Of those 16, 6 were denied. At the time that those requests came in, we were averaging just a hair under 3 confirmed depredations within the previous 12 months at that time. We approved 10 of those 16 lethal requests, and 6 of those resulted in lethal removal of wolves, which consisted of 16 total wolves. But if we break it down by our phases, and again, we're focusing on phase 2 and 3 here. In phase 2, we only went lethal once, and at that time there were 5 confirmed depredations when we went lethal, and again, the minimum criteria is 2. In phase 3, we've gone lethal 5 times, and we're averaging 4 confirmed depredations within the previous 12 months. So over all this time frame, only once have we ever actually gone lethal at 2 confirmed depredations. That was just last year on the Pine Creek pack. So continuing in this chapter, the draft plan follows the current plan that allows wildlife services to assist in conducting depredation investigations, but only in phase 3. We clarify that department protocols must be followed, and the department, as always, makes the final determination regarding a lethal request and the ultimate determination of the investigation. Regardless of who may be doing the investigation, even across our own staff, the plan identifies that we will continue to be rigorous and these investigations will be objectively conducted. It's evidence-based, and we want to be consistent across the state. And these determinations are still the product of the interactions of the local district biologists on our wolf program. Oftentimes, we will actually involve other district biologists if they're keen to the subject matter. For example, for a depredation investigation on sheep in the South Coast, we contacted our district staff in Pendleton because they're very familiar with wolf depredations on sheep. So we try to make sure that we've got the best eyes looking at this evidence So that way we're being as accurate as possible. And when we evaluate these investigations, whether, regardless of who's conducting them, we're looking at things like, was the proper protocol used? What was the level of physical evidence obtained? And what was the quality of the documentation? Even internally, when we get a lethal request, we're scouring over our own materials and calling up staff. And if we feel like there's some gaps or some holes there, we factor that into our ultimate decision. So for the remaining chapters, I will be very, very brief. But chapter
Gary,
5 addresses, oh, sorry.
Excuse me, before you go, leave 4, an important piece of this throughout is that ranchers and grazers are involved in lethal take once the department has made the determination that that can happen. And their agents can also do that. Could you just describe what an agent is and the training that person would have?
Chair-Friendly Commissioner Wall, what you're describing is the tool that is available under Phase 2 and Phase 3, where under situations of chronic depredation, the department can issue the landowner, the producer, or their agent a permit to conduct lethal removal. And in that permit, we lay out all the criteria, all the requirements of what you're allowed to do, your reporting requirements, and the expiration date of when that permit expires. We do not dictate or control who the landowner designates as their agent. That tool, I believe, has been used perhaps 3 times. We're starting to use it a little bit more. We're kind of testing it out. The first time, I believe, that we used that permit, an agent available to that landowner was a very experienced wolf trapper, actually. And so that was a great tool, a great resource for them to use. But we do not dictate what type of training or experience their agent has when it's an extension of that landowner, that livestock producer.
Thank you.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
I want to go back to the beginning of chapter 4 on the non-lethal measures for a question. So if you want to address something prior.
Oh, so you want to, okay. Doesn't matter who goes first. But this regarding, okay, so Derek, since, you'd probably go back a slide or two, but
There's a number on the top right corner of your slides.
yeah, so that little table that you provided for us. So since you mentioned that the reality on the ground, in terms of reporting, it is that we've been averaging 3 confirmed depredations within a 12-month period, and that we're all agreeing that we should be looking at grazing seasons and shorten that time frame, at least down to 9 months. I'm not understanding the proposal for 2 confirmed depredations if it's not a reflection of what's actually been happening in practice and on the ground. So why are we at 2 if it's not reflecting of what's actually going on?
Chair-Friendly Commissioner Woolley, this 2-9 proposal, as you can see on this slide, is a down the middle proposal based on those 2 proposals laid out here. We've always said we operate with discretion, and so 2 does give us flexibility. We did use it in 2018. There was a situation where there were back-to-back depredation events with a number of non-lethals being implemented at that time. I might request asking some of the folks providing public testimony their thought on that number. Because we know that 2, we would likely still not go lethal at 2, but it gives us the flexibility, the discretion to do so if there is kind of a in-your-face extreme circumstance.
So Chair Findley, Commissioner Woolley, I'll just add 2 being the current requirement in Phase 2 and Phase 3. When we went into the facilitated work group, the temporal component was really what we were bringing forth in that 3 and 12. It is through the negotiations that eventually 9 months as a grazing season was added as that temporal component.
Commissioner Buckmaster.
Going back to the first part of Chapter 4, Derek, I want to thank you. During our conference call, I brought up that I thought what was included in the plan on non-lethal was
Thank you.
lacking specificity and could even be considered confusing. And you made it clear to me that that wasn't where I should be looking. I should be looking on the website. And then in addition, you increase and the reason for people who are wondering, they gave me a good reason, that the non-lethal work, the measures, the write-up on that is an actively managed document that is changing on a regular basis. Therefore, if we were to adopt it in rule, any changes, any things that had been brought forward would require rule changes. That made sense. Consequently, we're referencing. My question to you is, I was happy with that. I saw the improvements or the additional information you included after the request, but I'm still not sure how we are directing people looking at the Wolf Plan to find the information on the non-lethal measures, the wealth of information you're providing. Can you show me specifically in the plan? I want it prominent, and I think it'd be good to let people know within the plan that we have an actively managed, adaptively document which deals with adaptive management on non-lethal. So
Let's see if I can, if there's not already. So on page 38, line 23, 22 and 23, we include a URL to that web page that contains all of our non-lethal tools and techniques. So right up front, before we even get into the details of what these various tools are, we start off by saying you can find more information on our website with that, and it's hyperlinked in the digital format.
I think the hyperlink is excellent. I think I would like to see more explanation of what that hyperlink does, what is in there within the plan, that the fact that we have an actively managed document that fills all this in. So a little more clarity of what they should be looking for. Other than that, thank you for the work on it.
Mr. Chair, I
Commissioner Wolf.
just have a procedural question. Since we're doing things a little differently today and we're asking questions as we go along, and it just takes us back for a minute. So given that special status game animal is in statute, which authorizes lethal take, Derek, and this is also maybe just confirmation from council, within that phase 3, is our commission authorized to address the details of how lethal take is implemented? In other words, trapping allowed or not, who is authorized to kill a wolf, who is a non-ODF&W employee, that sort of thing. And so I'm asking that question also based on our procedures, because I know, Mr. Chair, you often request a discussion as we get toward the end of this process. And I'm sure some of these finer points will be included in that discussion. So
They will.
they will. So I can defer this for later, because I think we'll get more into those details at that time.
Yeah, we will. Would you like counsel to answer your question?
Yes, please, Aaron.
Sorry, I was in another conversation really quickly at the start of it. Is what you're asking whether you have authority to amend the phase 3 rules today? Did I catch that?
Yes, yeah, more or less, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
you do.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
All right.
I have one more clarifying question,
Sure.
if I could, please.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
We've heard a lot about investigations and confirmation, who does them, how they're done, that sort of thing. There may be complaints about how quickly they happen, which is understandable, but But from all the conversations I've been in leading up to this, there's a high level of confidence in the department doing the investigations and confirmations. I would submit an enviable level of confidence in that, which is great to have. Not so much maybe in other people doing those. Could you just describe how much of the investigation confirmation work is done right now by the department compared to anybody else?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, the vast majority of the work is done by ODFW staff. However, case-by-case basis, we may have the local sheriff's office, USDA Wildlife Services with us. Any entity may be there, and certainly on private property, there can be all sorts of folks invited to that event. However, the work is being done by agency staff. As folks get more experienced, yes, those investigations can be done faster, but still upholding the same level of rigor. And we are inclined to try and get more people to understand what exactly it is that we're doing, what we're looking for. Fortunately, we do have a number of producers now that are pretty knowledgeable on what are the telltale signs. And so I've anecdotally heard stories that we have a number of situations where the producers are able to rule out wolf themselves, arguably saving staff time, which is enormously valuable. However, that's oftentimes limited to, say, Wallowa County, where they've got a decade of experience. Everywhere else, it's still very new, novel, for not only the producer, landowner, but also our agency staff. Did I answer all your questions?
Okay. Thank you, Mary. Okay, proceed.
Oh, who knows what, wait, we were on to, okay, chapter 5, is our ungulate and carnivore interaction chapter, which again, this was a combination of a couple different chapters, and really just wanted to point out there that this is another place where we inserted quite a bit of Oregon data. We included some tables and maps highlighting elk and deer population numbers in areas where wolves have showed up, to try to show if there's an impact that we've documented. To date, most of our elk populations are above management objective everywhere where wolves have shown up. Mule deer aren't doing the greatest across the state for multiple reasons, but likely not related to wolf. So we'll continue to focus on that type of a topic. Chapter 6 is our wolf-human interactions chapter. This doesn't get a lot of use on a day-to-day basis. However, there was plenty of stakeholder and public interest in this topic, and we added a human safety section at the request of the public. Then the following or the remaining chapters left in the plan, really few changes worth mentioning right now. But again, very pleased that we were able to update all these different components to help continue to guide and direct the agency and be transparent for the public on how we are going to respond to certain issues. So, in summary, I can say with a great deal of certainty that we adhered to the original guiding principles laid out in October 2016. We continued to maintain a conservation-based plan that is true to its origins, but we've added additional clarity. And this was important. That original plan was a multi-year process with a Wolf Advisory Committee, enormous level of negotiation back and forth to develop a lot of these criteria. And so especially when we do not have current data or research findings to contradict some of those criteria, we maintained those items in the plan, not trying to undermine that first effort. We've continued to build off the successes of this current plan, but we've tried to make it more usable, more user-friendly, easier, better read, and ultimately making this plan more effective, helping to direct what we are doing rather than it be just a kind of bloated plan that's just a catch-all for all types of topics. But focus on really what are the current issues and trying to predict within a reasonable distance into the future what are the potential concerns around the corner. In doing so, we're trying to reduce the uncertainty. Again, we don't want to make assumptions. However, if we've got quite a big stack of personal experience on a topic, we're willing to make a few more predictions and assumptions moving forward. Certainly filling remaining knowledge gaps is a priority and is absolutely imperative for future decision making. But ultimately, this plan reflects the current actions and understandings of wolf conservation and management in the state. It serves as a solid foundation for the next cycle of implementation, but arguably it also serves as a springboard for moving us forward and shooting us forward on a number of topics. We're actually very excited about these next steps in developing new models, human dimensions research, a lot of things that are growing needs, and having this plan to support that interest, that desire, and reflect the public engagement, we think is so important, and we're really happy about what's coming up around the bend. So, happy to take commission questions now before testimony, but certainly we'll be back later.
Okay, any burning questions? Otherwise, we're going to take a break and come back for public testimony. Commissioner Akins.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a little statement that I had. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to the staff and thank you to all of the stakeholders over the many years who have committed themselves to this process. It's certainly been long and drawn out, and we have very different perspectives we're trying to meld together, and appreciate all that we've heard from the public as well that give us information and have contributed to this plan. And I wanted to say to the folks who we see a lot of concern on both sides about this wolf plan, for all of you who, like me, have looked forward to having wolves living free in Oregon's forests and rangelands, it's time to celebrate. We have wolves in Oregon. They're a viable population, they're growing, and I'm discouraged to see so much negativity related to this plan development, because Oregon has come a long ways and Oregonians are committed to having a viable population of wolves in the state. And we need to be happy about that. The details of the plan, I don't think, are going to affect things very extremely one way or the other. And so it's a time to celebrate and be happy that our plan has been successful in the past. And this is a continuation of that success with this update. I just wanted to say a little bit about myself. I'm a wildlife biologist, and before I was on the Fish and Wildlife Commission, I studied wolves. I spent many years capturing and radio collaring wolves, watching pups at the den, and following wolves through the Idaho backcountry. They're a fascinating creature and certainly an animal that I care a lot about. Following that work in Idaho, my husband and I returned to Oregon and we settled in Wallowa County. This was just as the wolves swam the Snake River and moved in and established territories in Wallowa County. Since then, it hasn't been easy for the livestock producers in my community. They've had to learn and adjust to risks of wolves harassing and killing their animals. These livestock owners do everything they can to protect their animals from being killed by wolves. They spend extra hours tending their animals, checking on them. They're using non-lethal methods, trying all kinds of things that they may have thought were pretty bizarre ideas, but really searching for solutions to minimize the effect on their livestock. But we're here today to approve a new version of the plan. And I wanted to say I'm just amazed the stakeholders who originally came up with the 2005 plan were so foresightful that their predictions were often reality. They didn't know what wolves would do, but that plan served as a really good foundation for us. We're still using those 3 phases to monitor and manage wolves. We're using the 2 geographic zones to be able to separate eastern and western Oregon. And we're also still considering that as part of our tools for managing wolves, when numbers are higher, that controlled take continues to be a feature that we do need to address. It's always been in the plan, and it needs to stay in there. It's part of what has made this plan strong, has given both the conservation piece our plan has, as well as the ability to limit adverse effects of wolves. So I just wanted to say, I think that the plan in the past has been shown to be really successful. We've had 15 years of wolf population growth. We have a strong wolf population. It continues to rise, and I hope that everyone here can find some support for this plan. It has been stakeholder-driven, and the compromises have been difficult on both sides, but I think that it's a good, fair plan that helps us to move forward. And I hope that everyone can celebrate having wolves in Oregon. Even those of you who don't really want to have wolves in Oregon, this plan hopefully can keep us on track and make sure that no one is extremely adversely affected by having wolves here.
Okay, thank you, Holly. I think it's appropriate that we listen to your words and think about them on a break. So we're going to come back here at 5 minutes to 10 o'clock, and we'll start public testimony.